You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where Emily and I read the Bible, talk about it, and try to figure out what some of it means. So last week was cherubs,
Cherubs, yeah, I was thinking
cherubim, I guess would be the correct.
yeah, anytime you see a word related to the Bible that ends with that M or eem, it's pronounced both ways. It kind of just depends on who your teacher was.
Sure.
The M is, there's more than one. It's the plural form. So, yeah, so anytime you see cherubim, we're talking about multiples. When we're talking about cherub, we're talking singular because that is a Hebrew word.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I was actually, when you were doing your intro, I'm thinking, and we offer unsolicited opinions about things you didn't think needed comment on.
Yeah, unsolicited opinions about things that you didn't know needed opinions.
We got plenty of them. So we were talking about the cherubim. We were talking about how just a little bit the history of them and how they were common to the ancient Near East, how this was not an image that was reserved just for the Israelites or the temple, and how they differed from the tabernacle to the temple. And then we find out that they are overlaid in gold, and we kind of left there. And then we're going to talk about more of the building itself, where they were
Mhm.
located. So we're going to get into that, and we're going to see how many notes I have because it's been a crazy week around here too. So I keep thinking, I go, we shouldn't apologize for our life being crazy so much. It should just be a given at this point. It's just the way things go. So, but we're picking up First Kings chapter 6, verse 29. It says, "And all around the walls of the house he carved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms." So these designs, they're strictly ornamental. They were chosen though for a very specific reason, and the reason is they're supposed to remind you of the Garden of Eden. We have trees, we have flowers, we have the cherubim. And when you think back to the story of the Garden of Eden, where you've got trees, where there's fruit, you've got the cherubim, you've got we think of this lush, lavish garden that's beautiful. So flowers are automatically implied.
Mhm.
And you got to remember that this is sacred space, and the garden was the original piece of sacred space. It's the original temple created by God. And I think we overlook that. I know that that was not a concept I learned until I was an adult and out of seminary, the idea that Eden was a temple. And I highly recommend that you read my
Walton?
brain John Walton. I had John Walter, Walter Scott, John Scott, John Stott. I mean, all these names that didn't work. So John
John
Walton.
Walsh, Joe Walsh, Don Henley.
So, yeah, this all the names that didn't belong. So John Walton, he does a really good job of describing how this works and why it is sacred space. Now, the thing about sacred space, no matter what what form we're talking about, or the parameters as far as, like, where it was physically and the dimensions and what it looked like, it always has one common element, and that element is this is where God meets with humanity. This is where God actually intersects with our lives and makes himself known. That becomes sacred space. So, obviously, the Garden of Eden has to be sacred space because that's where God walked and talked and, all of these things interacted with Adam and Eve at a very personal, very intimate level. Then, you get to fast forward to the burning bush where, Moses actually has this encounter with God. And what does God tell him? Take off your crown because you're in sacred ground. You're in sacred space, to use a synonym there. And what's really interesting about this whole idea of sacred space is if you look at the binding of Isaac, one of the foundational stories of Judaism, and I really suggest that people study that story from as many different sources and from many different angles as they possibly can, because that story has so many little bits and pieces that make the rest of the Bible make sense. And it really begins with that foundational story there in Genesis. But that's on Mount Moriah. That is, another instant of sacred space because this is where, again, God shows up. And the Jewish tradition is that the temple is built on that same piece of property, that this is the same spot where Abraham was going to offer Isaac. It's also believed to be the same spot where Jacob wrestled with the angel, that these places where God appeared, very interesting, um, profound experience with humanity. That's what I was trying to think. These are stories that stand out in the Bible because of the level of intimacy which God appears.
Hmm.
And so, thought you had more to say there. So,
Nope. Sorry, I have very little to go on right now. I'm just waiting to see where the conversation takes us.
okay, well, yeah, but and I don't know whether or not I've seen arguments that it couldn't possibly be the same locations for all these events, and I've seen arguments that it absolutely is. It doesn't matter. The things that happened in these locations were of the same nature. They have the same kind of significance in the fact that God showed up. And so when we look at the temple, we look at the garden, we look at um, the burning bush, we look at the binding of Isaac, we see this. But then, New Testament, this is where we start to build our New Testament theology, where God shows up for the individual. God shows up within the individual, through the individual. And so the person becomes sacred space. We're the temple of God. We now, the Holy Spirit resides within us. And so the, we are sacred space, not just someplace on a map. And so this is where a lot of the ideas about, you know, showing our allegiance to the kingdom of God through loving kindness, because
Mhm.
it's a loving and kind God who acts through us. All of this plays together, and you can see if you begin to look at this, just the idea of temple throughout Scripture, you can see how important it is and how central it is to this idea that God wants to be with creation. And so that's what the temple is to remind you of, that originally the purpose of of the earth was to provide a place where humanity could thrive and God could meet with his creation and they could have this ongoing sustained relationship. Humans were the one who broke that. We're the ones who made that impossible, at least on the terms that it was in the garden. So, uh, and a real quick note, I don't even know if I should open this can of worms because it's kind of like winding you up and setting you off. Uh, One of the things that has come out of that teaching is this idea of total depravity. That when we broke that relationship, now we're so evil, we're so sinful that we have destroyed anything good has God has ever put in us. So we don't deserve sacred space. Okay. The structure and creation of the temple itself denies that. God, if we didn't deserve any kind of contact with God, why would he make provision for it even before the death of Christ?
Oh, well,
Yeah.
it's what we were told in Sunday school, right? That you know, the, they had the access just because they were looking forward to Jesus coming. That's
Yeah.
everyone was just sitting around waiting for Christianity.
Right. Well, and there's a certain element of truth in that. They were looking for the Messiah. They were looking for this final kingdom, this expression of God in a new way, in a very political way. But that doesn't mean that they felt like they had something, not worthy of praise, or that wasn't a great gift of grace to them. Um, they understood how significant it was that God would choose to manifest himself. And this is what we're going to find as we get later into the story. God chooses to manifest himself in ways that can be perceived with the senses and not just accepted on faith there in the temple.
Hmm.
So, the fact that God would allow that. And, I love Carmen Imes' book about bearing God's image. The by Sinai is still significant. It is so good at reminding us that God really does see us still as his creation and still bearing his image.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, and I know you were trying to bait me into going on a tirade about Calvinism. I don't have the energy today. Um,
trying to make my
that's
notes stretch.
well,
Uh,
I get that. I mean, we can talk about it. I don't know. Maybe I just need more coffee. But I've been it's been a long week. I've had sick kid and things like that. So it's
yeah, that'll zap you in a heartbeat. But yeah, but I do think one of the things that I do want to point out is, yes, humanity was damaged in the fall. Uh, that's unmistakable, that's undeniable. We were damaged in the fall. It doesn't mean we don't still bear the hallmarks of the greatest artist that ever existed and ever will exist.
right.
One of my favorite examples of this, and we all know the Venus de Milo. We know she's the woman with her arms broken off, her head's partly broken, and there's so many images due to the age and the way this image was not cared for a long time. Yet, we all know the image. We all know we can immediately recognize the quality of the artistry that went into that. We aren't
Hmm.
saying she's not damaged. We're still saying that she is a valuable piece of art for what she does still retain, even in her damaged form. And
Yeah, I
so,
mean, and damaged and beautiful and valued enough to personify it.
mhm,
Um,
yeah,
apparently. So, um, but no, that's actually, I mean, a good point because there was there was actually an exhibit here in Norman that surprisingly that they came to our I mean the Norman Art Museum is great. I'm not trying to
mhm,
downplay it, but for a town this size, it's really good. But it's also kind of a smaller museum. But we had there was actually an exhibit of some of the Roman statues,
mhm.
and yeah, and a lot of those were broken and chipped and but you could still see the level of detail and craftsmanship in them was incredible.
Well,
And
that's
and
actually.
well, and go ahead with your thing.
Oh,
I
I was
got
going to
another
say,
part on
actually,
total depravity later.
okay. One of the really cool, interesting things, one of the criteria amongst in some circles, and of course, art is something that's highly debated. What is it, and how do you define what art is? Blah blah blah. In some circles, some of the criteria of what is art is can it be damaged and still be beautiful, engaging, and not necessarily beautiful, but still retain enough of its in original imagery to be compelling. And so that's how you kind of qualify how good the art piece is and whether it is art or kitsch, because, I mean, you chip a figurine in your house, unless it has some kind of sentimental value, you toss it. If it's just kitsch, it's only useful and functional when it's whole, when it's complete. And so it doesn't have that same kind of, weight and value. I mean, if I scratch a Picasso, I'm not gonna throw it out in the garbage if I so whereas if it's just something I doodled, maybe, probably. So, anyhow, you were saying something.
Oh, I just the total depravity thing. I mean, we really have we one of the best proofs I can think of. And again, I'm going to get accused of I don't understand Calvinism or whatever. But it's one of the best proofs for that is to me is the flood narrative. You kind of see what happens when God's done with the project. I mean,
Yeah, I hadn't
or when
thought
it gets
about
so
it.
far out of hand. I mean, it's he used the flood to get rid of the parts of humanity that had become totally depraved. And yes, he saved
That's
a remnant, so you can't say humanity as a whole is not worth saving and not worth his time. But
uh,
I mean, it's a pretty definitive case there as far as I'm concerned.
huh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that one because 'cause I'm thinking, Noah was perfect in all his generation, sorry. Which is the same word that we use for sacrifice, the condition of the sacrificial calves and lambs and stuff, they have to be perfect.
Mhm.
Um, so, hmm, okay, I'm gonna play with that one because that's interesting. So, but yeah, I just really I just think that one of the things we need to look to is the fact that even in our broken, damaged state, God is still saying, "Hey, you still have something of value to be redeemed. You aren't just trash on the garbage heap that I happen to be, collecting because I can't get anything better." It's like, no, you still retain this imagery of the God who created you. And so, and we can take that too far, and we can get inflated, and we can with our ego and think, "Oh, look how great I am because I'm in the image of God." Eh, But that again, that goes back to that tension we're always talking about. That we have to recognize there is damage, but we still have to cling to the fact that God is our Father and He is our Creator, and that in and of itself gives us value.
Mhm.
And if we think that one human being's destructive act is more powerful than God's creative act, we're putting the emphasis on the wrong person.
Mhm.
So, I refuse to give Adam that much credit. So anyway, back to 1 Kings. What we find here is not only do we have this imagery that points us back to Eden, we also have this imagery of well, the we were talking about the flowers and the trees and stuff. The gold, the gold itself reminds us of again of Eden because if you go back and read that, and I've got it, we're going to talk about it here in a minute. Um, it's one of the elements found in the land surrounding Eden. It's one of the elements that's mentioned specifically, and, there are 4 elements that were named in Genesis. So verse, 31, it says, "The entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made the doors of olive wood, the lintel and the doorpost were five-sided." Now 5's an interesting number, and I don't wanna get too in depth with, "Okay, oh, what does this symbol mean, and what does that symbol mean?" Um, is some symbolism here. I'm not gonna deny that. But I think sometimes we can reach too far and just forget sometimes it is a building. So if it wasn't overtly created to be a symbol, like an image, like a painting or a drawing of a palm tree or a cherubim, we have to be careful. But 5 is an interesting number because traditionally 5 is means service. That's what it represents. So the temple was to be used in service of God and man so that they can meet. But we also the other number that's going on here is 4 because 4 is the number of the earth. You've got the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, the 4 corners of the earth, the 4 winds of the earth. That's Revelation 7:1. They're held back by 4 angels. So everything is about the earth typically is represented by that number 4. So when you add 5, this is a reminder, a visual cue. You're moving into that kind of 5th dimension. You're not 5th dimension, but that next level of space or being, something beyond this physical world. It's in addition to the world. And so there are these little symbols that people would pick up on, and and sometimes symbols are meant to be in your face, slap you upside the head, and sometimes symbols are supposed to just kind of gently ease you into a new thought pattern. And so I don't know, how significant this is, but that is just one thought I had about the fact that we do have the entrance is surrounded by this number 5, and how many people would actually stop to look at it, I don't know. So, I like playing with ideas like this, and I'm not gonna say they're definitive when I can't say they're definitive. If I can't point to a scripture verse that explains it the way I'm seeing it, I'm not gonna tell you that's exactly what it has to mean.
Mhm.
I just wanna throw it out there and say, "Hey, this is a possibility." And it is the kind of symbolism that artists would use. We'll actually find similar symbolisms when we get to medieval cathedrals and chapels and stuff, that the artist would start to bring in these kinds of thought processes of how do the number of items on display impact the way we think about stuff because we as human beings do associate certain numbers just automatic because of cultural context with certain things. I mean, I can say Friday the 13th, and because it's a 13, you're immediately going to go bad luck. If I say lucky number 7, it's all there in our heads. So verse 32, we have more gold. It's covering everything. It's everywhere. Verse 33, it says, "So he made for the entrance to the nave doorpost of olive wood in the form of a square." Verse 34, "And the 2 doors of cypress wood, the 2 leaves of the one door were folding, and 2 leaves of the other door were folding." So it seems to be, um a door that was you could, fold in half. There was kind of a bifold door there that allowed for a larger entry point into the temple and not to take up so much floor room. Now, cypress is interesting as one of the elements of the temple. Isaiah says that the thorn bush would be replaced by the cypress tree whenever the earth is renewed. So to have cypress here is kind of that reminder that there's going to be renewal. There's going to be a reversal of that curse on Adam where that's where the thorns came into existence. So even this is a reminder that you should be looking back to Eden once again when you're thinking about the temple.
Mm.
And now this is not in I want to acknowledge that the cypress used in Israel is completely different than the cypress I'm getting ready to talk about, but I did find this to be very fascinating. And there's a study, a very reputable study, it's been published in scientific magazines, that Japanese cypress, which is also used in their temples, produces a measurable calming effect when it's touched.
Hmm.
So you have to wonder if that even comes into play here. There, obviously, I couldn't find anything about the temple or the cypress trees in Israel producing the same kind of effect, or I would have totally cited that. But you have to kind of wonder, is there any kind of correlation? And somebody needs to do that study for me because now I'm curious. And we do know that, being surrounded by wood, natural objects actually does have a very calming effect on people. Of course, in that day and age, you wouldn't have had to gone to the temple to find it because you aren't going to be in rooms that have sheetrock and paint and artificial lighting. Everything you live in is going to be some kind of configuration of a natural material that was easily accessible. So, verse 35, we have this reoccurring theme again of the palm trees, the flowers, the cherubim, and gold. All of this is listed once again as being
Mhm.
part of the temple. Uh, you aren't supposed to miss this point. Verse 36, he built an inner court with the courses of cut stone and one course of cedar beams. So was really interesting when I was looking this up to find out, inner court with three courses of cut stones and one course of cedar beams, and they were talking about I found different layouts of the temple, explaining exactly what this court would look like. But as I got to digging deeper, what I was finding were I found drawings that were Herod's court, the second temple, the one the temple that Jesus would have been at.
Mhm.
And they're saying that Solomon's court or temple would have been constructed in almost the exact fashion. That because it's an inspired idea, it would have been consistent, there would have been this continuity between one to the other. Now, we do know that, this was not true because when the people returned from exile and they witnessed the second temple being built, they cried. Those who had seen what the first temple looked like and who witnessed the second temple, they knew there was a world of difference between the 2. And so, now there were renovations done between that time and when Jesus was there and what have you. Okay, but the reason why this is important is because when you read descriptions of Solomon's court, it doesn't line up. And one of the biggest points where it doesn't line up is in Herod's court, there were 2 courts. There was the court of the priest, and that was the area that surrounded the sanctuary. And then there's a small band uh, before the courtyard in front of the sanctuary, and that was the court of women. Solomon's court does not have a court of women. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah said that in Solomon's temple, there's no distinction between the sexes, that women could go anywhere the men went, with the exception of the priests when they did their official service. But no regular guy was allowed to go everywhere the priest was allowed to go. So
Mhm.
it's
Well,
really
it
interesting.
yeah, and what's really funny is the in I can already hear the fundamentalists trying to interpret that. Well, see how, the Herod came in and rebuilt it and messed things up by not not making sure that women were in their place, letting them in the temple. I can hear it in my head these,
There's going to be some argument that's
and I'm
offered.
just like, but that's not the
It-
case.
Right. Well, in the Torah, if you read all of the Torah and you read all of the description, there's absolutely no law that forbids a woman from going into any part of the temple.
Right.
It's just, it's not there. And, unless we're talking like the Holy of Holies, but again, regular people weren't allowed, the priests weren't allowed. So, I mean, there's certain distinctions based on the function of priesthood,
Yeah,
but
the
not,
only thing you might find is just if there was any, during menstrual impurity,
right,
which
right,
again, ceremonially impure, that's not
not
that's
sin.
not that's not sinful, right?
Yeah. And I don't think we can repeat that often enough. Being unclean or being impure i- is not necessarily a sign of being sinful.
Mhm.
And so some of the scholars,
I mean,
then
because really, I mean, sorry, if you really look at it, the ceremonially unclean versus sinfully versus being in sin. I mean, understanding that is really important because what's
Mhm.
God's first command? Be fruitful and multiply.
Right.
Well, if you read on into the Torah, there's there's
The process requires.
they're saying if you have sex, then you're unclean until the next day after you wash. Um, but
You're unclean after you give birth.
right. And so really the only way for God to intend for humanity to fulfill that first command without sinning, if you look at it as this means you're sinful,
Hmm.
the technology for that is just now coming into play. Um, so, I don't think that's what God had in mind.
Yeah,
It's you're not going to get new people without some time being ceremonially unclean. Um,
yeah,
I mean, that's probably the most delicate way to put it. Um,
yeah. No, well, and that's the thing. When we have to look at how we're using the terms, and we need to make sure we're using the terms as close to what the original use was as possible.
mhm,
But within the temple itself, we can we don't know exactly when this idea of the court of women came into play, when that was added to the temple as proper and good. Um, the best guess is that I read, and, really it was the only guess, but it makes sense to me, is that was probably a rabbinic ruling, that was put in place sometime during the Second Temple, and it was probably done in response to the sexual rituals and rites that were being practiced in other temples to say,
mhm,
"Hey, look, we're we're a little bit more holy than the rest of you. We don't have sex at our temple, for one thing. We don't have temple prostitutes, and we're so holy, we're even keeping the sexes separated so that people can't even accuse us of it," which is something very rabbinic to do.
mhm,
And, we can talk about whether that addition to the law was correct or not. I probably not, but you can kinda understand it. And so, I just found that to be very interesting that there wouldn't be a separation when we have heard our whole lives about how important this separation was in maintaining the order of worship.
mhm,
And, it's really good for me to know that God didn't say, "Oh, well, only men can come close to my presence." And when you think about it, women had to offer sacrifices, at various points of time due to their physical, body and the demands of it, and being able to offer those sacrifices would have required them going to the priest. So, anyway, to find that, by the way, you have to go to, like, Google page 58. Don't look for Google page 2 and 3, because you aren't gonna find that information. You've gotta dig deeper, and it's interesting to me that this is the kind of stuff this should be headlining stuff. This should
mhm.
be information that we should all be putting out there. Instead, it gets buried, and it gets buried because not enough people are clicking on it. So, Google is a popularity contest. Let's just be clear about that. So, verse 37. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Zev, and in the 11th year of the month, in the 11th year in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house is finished in all its parts, and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. Okay, so we have the basic facts from verse 1 of this chapter repeated in verse 37. And it sets this chapter off as a complete um, unit within the text. So you've got the beginning and the end. You're supposed to read this as one, the totality of what they're trying to explain here. So anytime you have sections in the Bible that have this repetition, you need to really be thinking about why is it considered a complete unit.
Mhm.
And then the final verse tells us that the project takes 7 years and 7 months. Okay. So the building begins in Zev. That's the month of splendor, of brilliance. This is when the trees begin to blossom. It's the time before the rainy season. But then Bul is the end of the harvest season. And this is when whatever's left in the field is beginning to weather. It's when the fodder for the livestock better be at least in the process of being prepared, when the heavy rains do begin to fall. And so you almost have this cycle being presented of seed time to harvest within the building of of the temple itself. And it's kind of an interesting image, but it's even more interesting when you realize that it's in preparation for winter, that it's happening at this time of preparation for winter, especially when you know what happens in the rest of the book. So that this really great almost time of a spiritual high is going to be followed by this time of almost spiritual barrenness within the land itself. So something to keep in mind, because we're going to move into some dark times in Israel.
Did you say within
Here,
the land itself?
yeah,
Okay, I
yeah,
misunderstood that.
yeah.
Go
Okay,
ahead.
yeah.
I was trying to figure out what you were talking about. Go
Like
ahead.
the people aren't going to have, because the temple's going to be destroyed, and so it's almost like they have to spiritually charge up before God totally takes it out of the equation. And so there, because the temple really became the central hallmark in um, this way of identifying who Israel was and defining who they were as a nation. And it was the ability to look back and remember those times that drew the people back into the land. So there's some a really kind of interesting psychological phenomenon that's going on here, where the temple and the memory of the temple, even if it was an inherited memory because you didn't see it yourself, but your parents or grandparents did, it brought people. It was the inspiration. It was the motivation for saying, "Hey, I need to reclaim this."
Mm,
So, I think I think sometimes we forget how really awesome it is that Judaism is even still has managed to survive. It
mhm.
really, I mean, even before the time of Christ, the fact that it survived through Egypt, and it survived through Babylon, and it survived through the Roman occupation, it's just mind-blowing. And then when we come to the modern day, the fact that we have Jews all around the world who still claim this heritage, and not just a genetic heritage, but also a spiritual heritage, right or wrong, it's amazing. It's
Mhm.
amazing because, honestly, I it doesn't make sense that they managed to cling to this stuff for so long. So that's kind of chapter 6. So we got the basic foundation, the basic building of the temple, it has been completed. This is not the interior. This is not, I mean, yeah, we got some decorating going on, but the
And I wanna clarify, you're not
okay.
saying that in, like, an anti-Semitic
No,
way.
no.
You're saying that in a way that's like, yes, there's debate on how Christianity and Judaism should interact,
Thank you.
and also, it's not like, "Oh, it doesn't make sense and they're so stupid." You're saying, like,
No.
on in the course of history, there's not like you're not gonna have a conventional, sociological reason, for the religion to have survived as long and as thrivingly as it did.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
you're looking at it from an academic standpoint. I wanted
Right.
to clarify that where
No, yeah.
you're not going off on the deep end.
I really hope that anybody who listens to us with any kind of regularity would know that I value what we get from Judaism and what we can learn through their scholars, and
Mhm.
you know, it's just to me, it maybe I should say it's incredible that they managed to survive as an intact functioning group with this
Yeah,
because
with as much oppression and with as much of the diaspora, how long that's going, it really there's a lot to it, and
well,
whenever you
yeah.
look at it from the perspective of history, it really is incredible.
Yeah, yeah, because I mean, anti-Semitism is real, just not with me. And so it'd be a lot easier just to abandon this belief system that seems to have failed them. If you just want to be like very um, factual, cut and dry, you
Mhm,
know.
mhm.
And so, and when I say for right or wrong, the fact that Jesus isn't acknowledged as the Messiah, that's a concerning, that's a troubling point within Judaism, and but at the same time
Well, it is for Christians,
for
it's not for
Christians.
them.
Not for them, yeah. Uh, but at the same time, it's like it still shows you the power that was kind of imparted to them as a people that God is just still it's still maintained. And this is a very esoteric conversation that we've gotten into because it's these are the kinds of things I like to think about, but I want to find better words before I go into actual conversations
Yeah,
about
well,
it.
in which I felt like we needed to clarify it. I'm like, "Man, that could be really misconstrued," and I know that's not what you meant, and I'm pretty
Right.
sure most of our listeners would know that that's not what you meant. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
So
we just wanna make sure, I try to we try to be precise about these kinds of things.
well, and yeah, that's well, see, I'm tucked away in the woods, and the only people I talk to is my redneck husband, our mother, and our sister. And so, where you're actually out with the public every day, and you have to be aware of these things. So, I think that kind of impacts how we view these things. I'm gonna have to become a little bit more polished, I guess. But anyway, but we've got this shift in chapter 7. That's where we're moving into chapter 7. And it's really kind of an abrupt shift. There's like no real good lead in because we go from reading about the splendor and all of this gold and this massive undertaking that took 7 years for building the temple, and then we go to this description of Solomon's palace, and we're given these details and dimensions that really demonstrate the extravagance of Solomon's home and even hints as to what it cost. And we're also told that he's gonna build a palace for, Pharaoh's daughter. There's a couple of other extra things that go into to his palace. And then after we get through all of this kind of stuff about Solomon and his home life and what he has going on, then we return back to the temple and its furnishings, which is kind of this really odd kind of break in the narrative because you would think that the sensible thing to do would be to start your account of the temple, walk all the way through what was involved in building the temple and furnishing it correctly, and then we can talk about Solomon. So when you have these kinds of things going on, because I mean, the temple account doesn't end till chapter 9, and we are chapter 6 and just going into chapter 7, and we're still talking about the temple in chapter 9. You wanna ask, "What's going on here? Why why is this thing, this completely almost unrelated event plopped in the middle of what should be, at least in my mind, a continuous, description?" So, the other question we could ask is, why include it at all? Because Chronicles never talks about Solomon's palace. He doesn't it just doesn't even bring it up. They aren't worried about Solomon's house. They wanna talk about God's house. So Chronicles doesn't even think it's important enough to mention. But I think one of the things, again, we have to remember Samuel and the Book of Kings, again, one book in originally, was written to answer the question of how did we get into this mess? And Chronicles was written to explain why in the world they would return to Israel. So there's 2 different things. I mean, and Solomon isn't their motivating factor for coming back to Israel. The temple and what he accomplished and the fact that God blessed these endeavors, absolutely. But Solomon on a personal level, he's a guy to be upheld and thought of very highly, but ultimately he's not a compelling enough reason. It's got to be about God and God's provision for the nation.
Mhm.
And so, because of these differences in the way that the books are written, Samuel and Kings, they're never going to miss an opportunity. The writer's never going to miss an opportunity to tell you how someone messed up.
Right.
They did that with David. I mean, that's just the way they wrote it. So by putting this chapter 6, and you've got that kind of encapsulated, unit within the text, and it tells us, exactly how long, very precisely, Solomon spent building the temple. They don't want you to miss it. They repeat the beginning date at the end of the chapter so you don't miss it. And then the opening verse of chapter 7 tells us that Solomon spends 13 years building his own house. So now they're forcing you to ask a question. Who's really the most important person in Solomon's mind? Is it the one whose house got 7 years, or is it the one whose house gets 13 years? Almost twice the number, twice the amount of time spent on his own dwelling versus God's dwelling. Now, um, that's not something you can just immediately answer, because I love Rashi and how he deals with it. Because Rashi, if he ever thinks you're a good guy, then you can do no wrong.
Mhm.
And if he doesn't like you, then you can do nothing right. So he likes Solomon, and he said, Solomon was so dedicated and so driven to get this done that this is the reason why the temple only took 7 years, was because, I mean, he was just pouring everything into it, and he was making it happen as quickly as possible. Where his house, he could kind of let go. He didn't have to be as on it. So, there's a couple of different ways of reading it, and we need to acknowledge that. And I like people who point out different ways of reading it, because it helps me recognize my own bias.
Mhm.
And I do. I come to the scripture with bias. I have that, and everybody needs to recognize that everyone has one. They have a bias, and they need to be paying attention for it. So this is the reason why we read contradictory materials. We listen to teachers we don't necessarily agree with. We go into books with an open mind, or we try to see where we have these preconceived notions. And, you know, the writer of Samuel and Kings, I think they want you to have that bias. I think they want you to have this kind of um dismissive kind of attitude towards Solomon being this great hero that Chronicles presents him as.
Right.
And so the there's also the question too of, if the time was doubled, was the
Size?
no, well, not so we got the dimensions.
Oh, that's okay.
Um,
That's
yeah,
true, yeah.
but it was the cost and the money, and,
Ah,
was the expense doubled? So that's another question. And the writer has made it very convenient in order to ask this question, because he put all of the numbers together for us. He put them right here side by side, where if he'd waited until chapter 9 or chapter 10 to go over Solomon's temple, we wouldn't be able to just look at the same page and, go, "Oh, I see." And if you got to scroll and you're, rolling and unrolling, it's gonna be even more inconvenient to try to compare the size and the number and all of these things that are being put out there. It's it's only whenever we have them together that it becomes something that's really, that allows us to compare and contrast. That's what I'm trying to say. And I found it very interesting that in verse 1 of chapter 7, there's actually this one little word. It's 2 letters in Hebrew, but, we translate it in English as entire. He finished his entire house. So
mhm.
all of the furnishings, all of the draperies and the rugs and the candelabras, and all of it was finished, where he seems to, like, build the building for the temple, and then he turns around and he pauses to build his own place, and then he goes back and furnishes the temple.
Mhm.
And so the placement kinda suggests that he paused what he was doing for God to bring more glory to himself.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the issues that we have with Solomon as he's presented within the Book of Kings. he is not somebody who is without his vanity, which is fitting given what he says in Ecclesiastes. So, verse 2, he built in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So this is the title of the house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Um, Obviously, this means that he uses cedars from Lebanon, that he used the same kind of wood that was used in the temple.
hmm
So he's treating himself on at least on this aspect as well as he's treating God. Then it says its length was 100 cubits and its breadth was 50 cubits and its height was 30 cubits. So the temple measures 60 cubits in length. So that's 40 cubits different. The breadth of the temple is only 20, where it's 30. There's 30 cubits different with the palace, and the height is 30. So they're both the same height. So Solomon's palace is larger than the temple, and the writer wants you to let that sink in. Um, and this is just the primary structure. This doesn't include the other buildings that he is going to add to this.
hmm
So the palace by comparison is pretty massive when compared to the temple. So in verse 2, we're told about the abundance of cedar beams used in the structure, and there's enough ambiguity to kind of make the precise nature and form of the structure a matter of debate. And whatever the final form is, I don't think that's really what the important part is. Whatever the final form is, it's an impressive undertaking with a lot of these cedars, which we've already discussed. They're hard to get, they're hard to harvest, they're hard to get to Israel. They're expensive, they require a major workforce.
hmm
And so this was an ongoing endeavor that took a lot of manpower, a lot of money to make it happen.
hmm
And we also need to remember these are also the trees that God himself is said to have planted. So, verse 3, more cedars. Verse 4, we have an amazing number of windows, um, which has led us to speculate that this was kind of his summer home, his summer palace, that he went there to kind of recuperate whenever it was getting hot in Jerusalem. So it was very much a building that was designed for the comfort of the king and meant to make sure that the king looked good to visiting foreign dignitaries. And honestly, I'm just going to say that's where I run out of notes. Uh, so, uh, yeah, it's been a crazy week, and I meant to work on them, get some more pages in before today, but
Well, it's all right. I mean, we generally run long, so we can run short every now and again. But
yeah. So I I find
sorry, I
it.
wasn't able to stretch them. I sometimes I have more to say. I'm
No,
just beat this week.
I tried. I like, I goaded you.
Baiting
But
the witness.
I know I led you right up to it, and you just wouldn't take the bait. And so, but yeah, we're gonna get some more into to this later because there's not a whole lot. I don't find Solomon's Palace all that exciting. Um, it it is what it is. I think that the only reason why there's any interest to it at all is to contrast it with what he put into the temple.
hmm hmm
And so I find it to be kind of interesting that a lot of time is spent on looking at Solomon's building projects, because we're also going to see that there's just this overlap of material. I think the only thing that he doesn't use as much of in his palace that he used in the temple was the gold itself. And so,
Fair enough.
yeah, I guess he thought that was a little extravagant. Imagine that. So, anyway, yeah, that's all I got.
Okay. Well, no, I mean, we'll take a look at next week and see what happens, and I'm sure everyone who's been listening, I'm sure they're very patient with us by now. But anyway,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Very much appreciated too.
so well, anyway, before we go on too much about that, everyone, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week. If you want to be part of the conversation, have some stuff to add to it. Raven Creek SC on the social media is where you can find us, and ravencreeksc.com is where you can find us and other Raven Creek Social Club programs. Um, brought to you by other fantastic podcasters who are mostly more organized than we are. So anyway, but everyone have a good week. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.